thank you for having invited me to speak today to the York Festival of Ideas. This talk is essentially a spin-off of a book that was just mentioned kindly that I did for Thames and Hudson. Now, there's quite a lot of public interest in pagans and paganism, but there's also a lot of confusion. And a lot of people aren't sure what these things are, what these words mean. So hopefully over the next 40 minutes or so, we'll be able to get to grips a bit better with what these terms actually mean. So part of the issue is that different people come to the term with their own ideas, often influenced by who they are, where they're from, what their own particular background and belief is. A member of many forms of Christianity, for example, will hear the word pagans and they may think about idolatry or blasphemy. And these are the ideas that might come to mind when they think about the term. A Hindu, by contrast, might hear the word pagans and sort of recur it and think of it as if it were a colonialist slur effectively used against Indians by British imperialists. Someone who comes perhaps from a more secular perspective might think of the term and associate it primarily with the ancient world, with the Parthenon of Athens, with Stonehenge in Wiltshire, or even with a film like The Wicca Man. Conversely, if someone self-identifies as a pagan, as a member of a modern pagan tradition, they may well bring feelings of warmth and to the term, and they attracts them and it appeals to them in a great way. So we have all these different meanings that can be associated with the term, and that confusion persists. Now, there are two main meanings or understandings of the term paganism and pagan. The first is the idea that pagans are the other against whom Christians define themselves. Christianity, of course, arose from the Roman province of Judea in the first century, and reflecting its influence, reflecting how it came from Jewish religion, it was monotheistic, believing in one deity, one God, whom it connected to the God of Abraham in Jewish tradition. Now, as it has primarily been used by Christians, particularly since the 4th century, paganism describes belief systems that do not venerate this God of Abraham. So pagan is someone who is neither Christian nor Jewish. That is the main meaning, number one. And of course, at the time that Christianity was emerging in the Roman Empire, this was a period in which most traditions in the empire were polytheistic, believing in many different gods and goddesses. And this, from a Christian perspective, was idolatrous. Of course, as time went on, the use of the word pagans became quite flexible. For instance, amid the Protestant Reformation, various Protestants looked at Roman Catholicism and said, look at its veneration of saints, look at its lavish churches, look at its ornate ceremonies. This is paganism. So we can see even Christians can use the term pagan against one another in certain contexts. And of course, it continues to be used by many historians and archaeologists discussing periods of particularly the European past, as a means of describing those religions which were neither Christian nor Jewish. Now, throughout most of history, the term pagans was never really used as a self-description. It was always a term that Christians used to describe others. That clearly was changing by the 20th century, at which point we have paganism become a form of modern religious tradition, and pagan thus becoming a self-identity that people openly use for themselves. And as we can see in this image, some people openly proclaim themselves as being proudly pagan. You have, for example, pagan pride marches in various places. So from being a pejorative term used against people who are neither Christian nor Jewish, it becomes a statement of self-identity. Now, the term pagan, of course, is a Latin word, Latin being the main language of the Roman Empire. Now, In its earliest form that we understand, a paganus was a person who lived in the pagus, or the country district. In this sense, a paganus was like our term yokel, or bumpkin, or rustic. Somebody who lives not in the urban metropolis, but in the rural area. How that word came to mean someone who did not worship the God of Abraham is not entirely clear, but several proposals have been set forward by classicists and historians. One argument associated with the Greek Hellenist Pierre Chauvin argued that the understanding of the word Pagani, or people of the place, came to be juxtaposed with the idea of the alieni, or the people from elsewhere. In this sense, the Pagani were those who worshipped the traditional gods of their community, whereas the alieni, the Christians, worshipped a god who had been imported from elsewhere, from Judea. This is one possibility for where the idea of pagan as a religious term came from. Another proposal, associated, for instance, with the classicist Robin Lane Fox, is that the term paganus was adopted by Christians through a different manner. Now, it's apparent that by the 2nd or 3rd century, the term paganus had developed an additional meaning, and this was the meaning of civilian, meaning a non-soldier. And it's likely this term originated among the Roman military. Now, early Christians thought of themselves as miles Christi, soldiers of Christ. Hence, it is possible that early Christians adopted the term Pagani to describe those who had not enrolled, as they saw it, in Jesus' army. So that's the other possible origin of the term. But of course, in other languages, other terms have been picked up to mean very similar things. In modern English, we have, for example, the word heathen, which has very similar connotations to the word pagan. Now, English is, of course, a Germanic language, part of the Germanic language family, and there are parallels, other very similar terms, related terms, in other Germanic languages. Heiden in German, Heidenen in Dutch, Heathen in Icelandic, for example. And these terms all originate from a now extinct Germanic language, an East Germanic language called Gothic. Now, the origins of this term started as the word heithno, which was coined by a Christian missionary of Greek descent called Ulfilas. Now, in the 4th century, he was involved in the Christianization of Gothic speakers, and he was translating the Gospel of Mark, which is a Greek text. Now, the Gospel of Mark refers to a Hellenis, a Greek woman. Now, at this particular point in time, we're talking about the 4th century here, the term Hellenic, which we associate with Greece, had also developed connotations of the word pagan. So Orphelas was reading it not as Greek woman, but as pagan woman. And so in translating this Greek text, this Greek gospel, into Gothic, he changed Hellenis into heithno. And that term has since filtered through the other Germanic languages, giving us heathen today. Many people believe it links in some way to this understanding of the meaning of the heath, of the wilderness, of the rural wilderness. If this is indeed accurate, it's possible that Ulfilas may have been alluding to the sense of rurality and rusticity that was found in the Latin term paganus. Now, of course, other languages have also adopted similar terms. In East Slavic languages, for example, Ukrainian, Russian, Belarusian, there is the term yazychnik, which again has very similar connotations to heathen, to pagan. So what is clear is that wherever Christianity went, the Christians had the rhetorical arsenal through which they could define themselves against those who did not worship the God of Abraham. Wherever they went, they could say, we are Christians, they are pagans, they are heathens. Now, this continues right through into more modern periods. From the 15th century in particular, we see Christian Europeans increasingly seek to colonize and missionize other populations around the world. And many different Christian denominations were engaged in that. For example, Roman Catholics through the Spanish and Portuguese empires in what we now call Latin America, Eastern Orthodox Russians pushing through to what is now called Siberia, Protestants, for example, of Northern Europe, moving into other parts of North America, and also the Sami, moving among the Sami of far Northern Europe. And all of these peoples they were encountering did not worship the God of Abraham. And so Christian Europeans took with them this rhetoric, this concept they had about pagans. For example, in the early 19th century, it was common to find Christian British writers refer to the traditional belief systems of the Indian subcontinent as Hindu paganism, and the people who practiced them as Hindu pagans. Of course, now it's not common to refer to Hinduism as paganism, but this was the rhetorical framework with which these people were working. And in many places, they were able to establish Christianity, sometimes as the major religion, in other cases as a minority religion. Now, it's far less common to find the word pagan used in this sense now. I think that's because there's a general recognition that it is a Eurocentric term, it is certainly a Christian-centric term, and thus it's considered inappropriate for a world of post-colonial states and interfaith dialogue. Now, while you have this sort of colonialist use of the word pagan, this missionizing use of the word pagan, there is a parallel and very different development that was taking place in Europe itself. And this was the increasing embrace of the pre-Christian past, of Europe's particular pre-Christian past, as something positive. This stems in large part from the Renaissance humanism that came out of Italy around the 14th century and was reflected in a renewed interest in classical literature, the work of Homer, of Virgil, of Ovid, and also a renewed interest in classical art and architecture. And you've begun to see scenes from classical mythology feature on furniture, on sculpture, on ceramics, on paintings, on prints. And certain spaces, particularly gardens or public fountains, were deemed particularly appropriate for such mythological scenes. There's no evidence that people were actually reviving the worship of pre-Christian divinities at this point. And if anyone was, they were probably keeping it quite quiet. But nevertheless, it showed the impact and the interest in the pre-Christian world, certainly the pre-Christian classical world. And that only continued into subsequent centuries. Indeed, the classical Greco-Roman mythology reached the height of its artistic popularity in the 17th and 18th centuries. To know all about Homer and about Virgil was a statement of your education and refinement in this time. Now, it wasn't just the classical world that began to attract renewed interest. From the 17th century onward, Icelandic medieval manuscripts that discuss what we would now call Norse mythology began to be translated into modern languages. And certainly by the 18th century, these Norse deities were beginning to appear in artwork, often, however, dressed anachronistically in classical clothing. Moving forward into the early 19th century, we see the Romantic movement, in many respects a rejection of the Enlightenment, in which poets, artists, writers were beginning to again embrace interest in the pre-Christian world. This was accompanied by growing cultural nationalisms, often influenced by the burgeoning field of folkloristics, and many scholars and educated people began to look at existing folklore, particularly the folklore of rural areas, in search for what they often called pagan survivals. And it was this sort of approach that resulted in a growing interest in the histories and traditions and cultures of linguistically Celtic, linguistically Slavic, linguistically Finnic communities, and thus the publication of, for example, the Welsh medieval Mabinogion or the Finnish Kalevala. Now, these texts, as well as helping to set the stage for the emergence of fantasy fiction, think for instance the work of Tolkien, also set the stage for modern paganism. Now, modern paganism is not one single religion. in the sense of Christianity, Buddhism, etc. It is instead a family of related religious movements. And in the sense of it being a family, we can compare it, for example, to the Abrahamic religious family, in which we find Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. What you have with modern paganism is a set of different new religious traditions which show a certain family resemblance. What they share is that they are directly inspired by the extinct pre-Christian and pre-Abrahamic religions of Europe, North Africa, and parts of Western Asia. Now, the reason why we restrain it to those particular regions is because in other parts of the world, Christianity and other Abrahamic religions were not able to completely obliterate the existing traditions. In many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, in Southern Asia, and in parts of Eastern Asia, certainly, the pre-Christian traditions survive in various forms. Now, there's considerable variation among the modern pagan traditions. Theologically, for example, what they share is that they are drawing on pre-Christian deities and deity images, but actually some modern pagans are monotheists, believing in one god or one goddess. Many are polytheists, believing in many different gods and goddesses. Some are atheists who adopt the imagery of these deities and see these images as symbolically important, but they do not believe that these deities literally exist. There's also many differences when it comes to, for instance, ethical and moral perspectives and general worldview from some modern pagans who weave their traditions and their beliefs in with forms of sort of left-wing progressive politics, forms of feminism, for example, or gay liberation movements, while others link their beliefs into ultra-conservative, sometimes far-right traditions. One way we can sort of conceptualize modern paganism is as a pole from an eclectic end, where traditions are drawing on all manner of influences to build what are obviously modern construction, modern invented traditions, to the other end of the pole, reconstructionist pagans, people who are really interested in trying to accurately rebuild, reconstruct particular traditions from specific regions. Now, sometimes modern pagans, because they face certain issues, they are minorities, they may face prejudice and discrimination, they often band together to operate collectively for their collective interest. Thus, for example, you have the Pagan Federation, which was formed in Britain in 1971, or the European Congress of Ethnic Religions, which was founded in Vilnius in 1998. And these operate as sort of umbrella organizations to assist modern pagans of various kinds. Now, modern paganism as a sort of milieu arose out of a broader occult milieu across the Western world during the late 19th century. For example, the ancient Egyptian goddess Isis finds her name used in Isis Unveiled, an 1877 book by Helena Blavatsky, the Russian founder of the Theosophical movement. Similarly, Isis gives her name to Isis Urania, the first temple of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, established in Britain in 1888. So we can see from these sort of late 19th century occult movements that there was a growing interest in the iconography and the rhetoric of the pre-Christian world. Into the early 20th century, you begin to find groups emerging again from this occult milieu that seek to, in some ways, venerate deities from these pre-Christian societies. One of the earliest was Thelema, established by the occultist Aleister Crowley in 1904. He drew heavily on ancient Egyptian imagery, including the stele of revealing, as he called it, which we see here on the right. You have the Adonistic Society, founded in 1925 by Franz Sattler. He constructed his own mythology with 5 central deities who included Adonis and Dido, 2 figures from Greco-Roman mythology. And then you have the Church of Aphrodite, founded in New York in 1939 by the Russian immigrant Gleb Botkin, a man who had fled the Bolsheviks in the Civil War, and who argued that Aphrodite was not just the deity who appeared in Greek mythology, but was really a goddess who was monotheistic. In his words, she was the creator and mother of the cosmos. However, by far the best known and largest form of modern paganism that we know today is Wicca. Wicca emerged in England in the 1950s, and the man at the front of propagating it was a chap called Gerald Gardner. He presented it as the survival of an ancient pre-Christian witchcraft tradition. Now, this idea was not necessarily his own entirely. It was based on arguments made by historians and folklorists in previous decades, most notably Margaret Murray, an Egyptologist who had argued that the witches persecuted during the early modern period, that is the 16th, 17th centuries, had actually been members of a pre-Christian religion devoted to a horned god. So this was the framework with which, from which Wicca emerged, this historical framework. Many Wiccans now accept that this is an ahistorical story, but it was important in the development of the tradition. In the 1960s, as Gerald Gardner himself passed away, the tradition spread to Australia and to the United States, where it began to take on new forms. In the USA, for example, you had variants developed based on particular cultural groups. Stregeria, for example, was a form of Wicca influenced heavily by Italian folklore and Italian legend. You also had groups like Dianic Wicca, which emerged in California in 1971 and explicitly combined the Wiccan religious structure with second-wave feminism. And then you had the Minoan Brotherhood, established in New York in 1977, which established itself as a Wiccan tradition for gay and bisexual men. The 1970s also saw the dramatic rise in the number of Wiccans presenting their religion as a nature spirituality or earth religion, and this became an important part of the rhetoric of the movement. The 1970s also saw a big rise in the number of books published which outlined how anyone who read them could become a Wiccan themselves. Prominent authors in this trend, for example, included the Britons, Jonathan Stewart Farrar, or the American Scott Cunningham. By the 1990s, many of these do-it-yourself Wiccan books were actually catering specifically to a teenage market. One of the best-known authors of this kind was Silver Ravenwolf. And this in turn fueled a rising number of teen Wiccans. And this was mirrored and encouraged by popular culture portrayals of witches in this decade, the likes of Charmed and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Now, Wiccans typically identify as witches. They meet in groups called covens, although the majority actually only practice the religion on their own as solitaries. The religion is theologically diverse. When it emerged, it was initially devoted to a horned god and a mother goddess. But the Dianic Wiccan tradition that I just mentioned, it is a form of monotheism. It's a form of goddess monotheism, worshipping only the goddess. And there are other Wiccan groups that have become more explicitly polytheist, worshipping a wide range of deities. Ritual in Wicca typically involves an altar with various ritual items, as we can see in this image, and it takes place within a specially cast ritual circle. Wiccan ritual are usually expressly presented as being magical, and in using this term, Wiccans typically understand that they are using the human willpower, often channeling the human willpower through the ritual actions to enact physical change in the material universe, usually for healing, to help someone gain employment, these sort of helpful ends. And indeed, many Wiccans adhere to an ethical tenet called the Wiccan Rede, in which holds that they should harm none through their rituals. Wiccans also typically celebrate a series of 8 festivals throughout the year, collectively known as the Wheel of the Year. Probably the second most widely known form of modern paganism is modern religious Druidry. Now, the original Druids were ritual specialists who lived in various linguistically Celtic societies in Western Europe during the Iron Age. The Romans sought to stamp them out and indeed massacred many on the island of Anglesey in Wales. Now, there was a renewed antiquarian interest in these Iron Age Druids during the 18th century. At that particular point, you also begin to see some people self-describe as Druids themselves. The early groups that did so were often based on the fraternal model, akin, for example, to Freemasonry. You have, for example, the so-called Ancient Order of Druids, founded in London in 1781. Particular interest in the idea of the Druids and the image of the Druids is reflected by various Welsh figures, for example, Iolo Morganwg and William Price. They contributed to the adoption of the Druid as a figure at the Welsh Eisteddfod, and thus the Druid came to be bound up with ideas of a modern Celtic identity, not just in Wales, but in other parts of what is now understood as the Celtic world. By the early 20th century, you also had modern Druid groups emerge that began to self-identify or as more spiritual rather than cultural or fraternal. For example, the Church of the Universal Bond, now called the Druid Order, that was established in 1909. There was also a flourishing of new Druid groups in the 1960s. For example, the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, founded in 1964, and the Reformed Druids of North America, established by students at Carleton College in Minnesota in 1963. Increasingly, modern Druids came to be associated with sort of countercultural ideas, and by the 1990s were beginning to call themselves pagan more regularly. Now, Druids are often based around groups called groves, although as with Wiccans, many operate solitarily. Many, for instance, choose to wear robes during their rites and perform rituals at stone circles, as we see here, Stonehenge. This is inspired by antiquarian speculation that the ancient Iron Age Druids had been the builders of such sites. Now, modern Druidry is, like Wicca, theologically eclectic. You will have many practitioners who venerate deities associated with linguistically Celtic societies, from Britain, Ireland, Gaul, for example, but they will also pay respect to spirits of the place, spirits of the ancestors, and often through giving offerings to these entities and performances of poetry, performances of songs to these entities. And thus the idea of Arwen, or divine inspiration, is important for many modern pagan Druids. And this image we have on the left is the symbol of Arwen used by many practitioners. Another group of modern pagans who have a prominent role in this sort of environment are heathens. These are people who seek to venerate deities drawn from pre-Christian linguistically Germanic societies. Most often, this means people who spoke Old Norse, because our sources for Norse mythology, pre-Christian Norse theology, are a lot fuller than they are for other parts of the linguistically Germanic world. Now, heathenry actually arose in Germany and Austria in the early decades of the 20th century, and at that point in time was often interwoven with the broader Volkish ultra-nationalist milieu. Early examples include Guido von List, who promoted a tradition he called Wotanism, or the German faith movement that was established in 1933. It was in the late 1960s and 1970s, at the same time as we begin to see a flourishing of Wicca and modern Druidry, that you see a revival of interest in heathen religion. Groups like the Odinist Fellowship, forming in 1969 in North America, the Viking Brotherhood, also in the United States, and the Odinic Rite forming in 1972 in Britain. Now, these groups often shared the earlier idea of folkish identity. Increasingly in English came to be called folkish. But by the 1980s and 1990s, increasing numbers of people embraced heathenry, but rejected these folkish ideas and emphasized the idea that heathenry should be a religion open to anyone, regardless of nation or race. And thus, this sort of universalist heathenry spread quite widely through the internet, through groups like the Ring of Troth, now simply called the Troth. And a survey conducted in 2015 suggested that universalist heathens probably now outnumber folkish heathens within that community. Now, heathenry is typically polytheistic, worshipping deities from these pre-Christian Germanic societies, like the Old Norse gods Odin and Thor and Freya. They may also adopt cosmological ideas from Old Norse mythology, for example, about the world tree Yggdrasil. They often meet in small groups, which in English are typically called kindreds or hearths, but again, many practice solitarily. And the tradition often involves offerings to deities as well as the spirits of the land, which are referred to as blot, using an Old Norse term. Now, another modern pagan tradition that we can find is the attempted sort of new religions based upon the pre-Christian beliefs of linguistically Slavic peoples. Now here, the preferred term is usually native faith. In Russian, this is translated as Rodnovery. In Ukrainian, it's Rodnoverstvo. There are other terms in Czech, Polish, for example. This is a term that's been popularized in particular in the 1990s. Now again, like the Germanic-oriented heathenry, Rodnovery emerges from the sort of 19th century cultural nationalism, as scholars and other educated people were increasingly interested in looking for what they understood to be pagan survivals in folklore. Now, these Slavic modern paganisms arose largely in the 1930s. There are, for example, some people involved in Jan Stachniuk's Zadruga movement in Poland during the 1930s who were quite interested in reviving worship of pre-Christian deities. But amid the rise of the Soviet Union, these ideas were often suppressed, and instead they germinated and grew abroad. Lev Silenko, for example, was a Ukrainian who fled after the Second World War and moved to Canada, where in 1966 he founded the native Ukrainian national faith movement. It was only in the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Silenko's group were able to open a branch in Kyiv, and more broadly across the linguistically Slavic world, we begin to see many more Rodnova groups emerge. Now, Rodnovery is primarily organized through groups, and there are comparatively few solitary practitioners, in contrast to that which we've seen with heathenry, Druidry, and Wicca. They venerate various deities drawn from medieval sources, but their interpretation of them can often vary. Silenko's native Ukrainian national faith movement, for example, emphasizes a monotheistic belief in the solar deity Dazhbog, but many other Rodnova groups are polytheistic, venerating a range of different entities. Like other forms of modern paganism, Rodnovas are often very interested in folklore and seek to paganize that folklore, looking for what they see as pre-Christian elements within it. Now, Rodnovery is also often, like forms of folkish heathenry, ethnic nationalist in nature, and some practitioners take that into very extreme and national socialist approaches. They are also, for example, highly socially conservative and emphasize the importance of the collective over the individual. A very different take on modern pagan religion is that of the goddess movement, sometimes called goddess spirituality or goddess feminism. This is a tradition that arose largely in the United States during the 1970s, having emerged out of second-wave feminism. It's a tradition primarily for women, although there are a few men who are involved, and it was spearheaded both by feminist groups like Dianic Wicca, but also the writings of people like Carol P. Christ, a theologian who wrote the essay, Why Women Need the Goddess. Now, the central aspect of the goddess movement, as you can imagine, is goddess imagery. But there's nevertheless a theological eclecticism here. Some practitioners would see the goddess as a single monotheistic entity. Others would embrace a wide range of different goddesses, not just drawn from pre-Christian Europe and neighboring areas, but also, for example, from Hinduism or from Shinto, which sometimes raises concerns about cultural appropriation. Now, as with the sort of contemporary New Age milieu, there is often an emphasis on personal authority and personal experience in the goddess movement, with rituals often celebrating phases in the female life cycle or emphasizing the idea of healing women from domestic or sexual abuse or other problems that women may face. Another recurring element of the goddess movement is what the scholar of religion Cynthia Eller has called the myth of matriarchal prehistory. This is the notion or the belief that much of human prehistory was centered around a goddess or multiple goddesses without accompanying gods, that it was a period when men and women lived in equity and society was peaceful and lived in harmony with the earth. Common to this belief is that around 3000 BCE, this goddess worshipping society was overthrown and became patriarchal, either because of natural disasters or invaders from, particularly usually identified as coming from the Russian steppe. This idea of ancient goddess venerating societies predating patriarchal ones had initially been put forward by a Swiss historian or writer, Johann Jakob Backhofen, in 1861, and it had become widespread in intellectual culture during the late 19th century. It influenced the work, for example, of Friedrich Engels or Matilda Joslyn Gage. It fell out of favor among sort of scholarly communities in the early 20th century, but was resurrected for the second wave feminist movement through the writings of the artist Merlin Stone and the archaeologist Maria Gimbutas. So I've hopefully given you a little bit of an idea of some of the main forms of modern paganism that can be found in the world today and the variation that can be found among them. So what are the future of paganism? One thing that's apparent is that these traditions are gaining increasingly mainstream recognition. This may be through interfaith work with other religious traditions, but it may also be through popular culture depictions and the way that those influence how people understand what it means to be a pagan. We can also see an increasing diversification. I've talked here about some of the largest modern pagan traditions, but we see others as well. People who are devoted, for example, to the gods of ancient Greece, to the gods of ancient Rome, to the gods of ancient Egypt. And thus we are seeing increasing numbers of different traditions emerge. And the third point is that we're seeing increasing levels of communication between modern pagans and traditions that Christians would themselves have called pagan. Thus, for example, we see increasing collaboration between modern pagans and Hindus in India, or in parts of the US between pagans and practitioners of African diasporic religions such as Voodoo and Santeria. Maybe we'll see the emergence of some sort of pagan international unifying many of these non-Abrahamic traditions. In these ways, modern paganism is likely to exert a not inconsiderable influence on our world as we continue to move forward in what are often, for many reasons, uncertain times. Thank you.